Princess Exalvana of the Sarathari Dominion had never imagined her life would end like this, alone and helpless on a desolate, frozen moon. Her shuttle, the Elysian Veil, had been struck by a sudden burst of electromagnetic interference from the planet's rings, causing her vessel to spiral out of control. She barely managed to guide it to the surface of Vedra 7. But the crash was inevitable. Now the cold seeped into her bones, and her body, made for the warmer, lush planets of her homeworld, was ill-equipped to withstand the savage frost of this wasteland. Zalvana's once glowing violet eyes flickered dimly, her delicate, silver-tinted skin slowly turning an eerie shade of blue as the temperatures outside plummeted. She could hear the wind howling against the hull of the wrecked shuttle, and the only sound in the world was the relentless crunch of ice beneath her boots. There was no sign of life for miles, just the endless expanse of white and gray. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she staggered away from the shuttle, desperately trying to signal for help, though she knew the chances were slim. The distress beacon was her only hope, sending out a pulse across the dark void of space. Her people would find it, eventually. But as the hours dragged on, her mind began to slip. The cold was relentless, and no matter how much she tried to activate her personal heating system, it was barely enough to keep her conscious. She could feel her energy draining away with every passing minute, and it wasn't long before she collapsed onto the snow, her vision blurring. Her slender, almost fragile form was no match for the brutal elements of this barren moon. She closed her eyes for a moment, willing herself not to give up, but the darkness beckoned. If no one came, she would freeze to death, alone in a cold world that didn't care. But as the final moments approached, something extraordinary happened. A faint signal reached her ears, a deep, rumbling hum that echoed across the snow. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her, but the sound grew louder, becoming unmistakable. It was the roar of engines, alive, powerful engines. Someone was out there. She forced her eyes open, her vision blurry but desperate. She tried to focus on the silhouette of a ship descending through the storm, its lights blinking through the blizzard, fighting the wind with sheer might. It was a small vessel, rugged and unpolished, nothing like the sleek crafts of her people. The shape was strange, but it was a ship, and it was coming toward her. With every ounce of strength she had left, Zalvana activated her communicator and sent out one last, barely audible transmission. Help, please. She wasn't sure if anyone would hear it. She wasn't even sure she could keep herself awake long enough to see the ship land. But then, just as her vision began to fade, the ground beneath her trembled slightly, and a shadow fell over her. A figure, tall and strong, emerged from the blinding storm. She couldn't make out much, but she could see that the person was human. She could tell by the bulky suit they wore, a rough exterior covered in frost. The human was moving toward her quickly, each step confident and purposeful, as if they had a mission. Zalvana's pulse quickened, a spark of hope igniting in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't going to die alone after all. Miles Carter had been drifting through the stars for years, a solitary wanderer in the vastness of space. A former Terran Marine, he'd traded in his armor for a rugged life as a deep space salvage pilot, hunting abandoned ships and exploring the unknown corners of the galaxy. His ship, the Nomad's Resolve, was a tough, no-nonsense vessel, built for survival in the harshest environments. As he navigated through the icy expanse of Vedra 7, he wasn't expecting much more than the usual routine. Scans of the debris fields, checking for anything valuable left behind. But then he picked up the distress signal. It was faint, barely a whisper against the cold void, but it was there, and it caught his attention. He'd learned long ago to trust his instincts, and something about this signal felt different. It wasn't just a random call for help. There was urgency in it, a desperation that didn't sit right with him. Whoever this is, they're in trouble, Miles muttered to himself as he adjusted the controls of his ship. The scanners blinked, showing a faint signature through the storm. He could barely make out the source of the signal, But the coordinates were clear. The wreckage of a vessel, likely a crash. The cold on Vatra 7 was unforgiving, and he knew that if someone was out there, they didn't have much time. The planet's temperature was plunging fast, and survival in those conditions was a slim hope at best. Without hesitation, Miles punched in the landing sequence. His ship's thrusters roared to life, cutting through the blizzard as he descended toward the crash site. Visibility was nearly zero, but he trusted his instincts. He'd survived worse, and he wasn't about to let someone die if he could do something about it. As he touched down with a jolt, the snow kicked up, the wind howling fiercely around the ship's hull. He donned his exosuit, a heavy, insulated armor designed to withstand the harshest climates, and sealed his helmet. Stepping out into the storm, he could barely see his hand in front of his face, but he kept moving, trusting the tracker on his wrist to guide him toward the wreck. The shuttle was badly damaged, its hull crumpled like a tin can. Miles knew that whatever had happened here wasn't just an accident, it was a catastrophic failure. He scanned the wreckage with his suit's sensors, searching for signs of life. His heart pounded as he caught sight of a figure lying in the snow, almost invisible against the frozen landscape. Her skin was pale, a strange silver blue that looked unnatural in the harsh cold, and her hair shimmered with a faint iridescent glow. She was beautiful, even in the most dire of circumstances, but it was clear that she wasn't going to last much longer. Without thinking, Miles rushed to her side. He crouched down, scanning her for injuries, but his priority was clear. She needed warmth now. Her breathing was shallow, and her body temperature was dangerously low. He didn't waste a second. Gently, he scooped her into his arms, feeling the chilling cold of her skin against his suit. His heart tightened at the sight of her. She was too fragile, too alien. And yet, there was something about her that stirred a sense of protectiveness deep inside him. "Hang on," Miles muttered as he adjusted his grip and started heading back to the ship. Every step felt like it took an eternity, the wind battering against him, but he wasn't going to give up on her. She was a stranger, someone he didn't even know, but right then, that didn't matter. She was alive, and he wasn't going to let her slip away. He gritted his teeth and pushed through the storm, determined to get her to safety. The battle with the elements was just beginning, but Miles was no stranger to survival. And right now, he wasn't about to let her die. The moment Miles Carter crossed the threshold of his ship, he felt the blast of warm air from the Nomad's resolve wash over him. It was a small comfort compared to the freezing world outside, but it was enough to steady his racing heart. His arms trembled slightly from the weight of the woman in his arms, her delicate form nearly lifeless, yet somehow still clinging to the faintest thread of life. She was cold, colder than any human could survive, but there was something about her that fascinated him. Her skin, shimmering silver with an almost metallic sheen, seemed alien, like something out of a forgotten myth. Her hair, long and flowing, looked almost liquid in the low light of the ship's cabin. Miles knew this was no ordinary person. Gently, he laid her down on one of the ship's medical beds, his gloved hands careful not to hurt her further. Her face was serene, almost ethereal in the way her features held an otherworldly grace, despite the danger she was in. Miles immediately activated the ship's emergency heating system, the warm light of the medical bay flickering to life. He watched closely as the temperature inside the room rose, the warmth slowly starting to seep into her frozen body. The woman's breathing was still shallow, but there was a faint rise and fall of her chest, a sign that she hadn't slipped entirely into unconsciousness. Her violet eyes fluttered open briefly, focusing on him through the haze of confusion. There was fear in her gaze, but also a deep sense of gratitude, as if she knew, somehow, that she was being saved. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she gasped softly, trying to speak, but the cold had numbed her throat. Her voice was a soft whisper when it finally came. Who are you?" Her words were strained, like she'd barely enough strength to form them. "I'm Miles. Miles Carter," he replied, pulling a nearby chair closer to her bed. He'd done everything he could to warm her up, but the ship's medical systems needed time to bring her back. "You're safe now. You're going to be okay." She blinked at him, still not fully aware of her surroundings. The alien woman's body seemed to relax slightly, the warmth beginning to take effect. Her hand moved, almost instinctively, to her throat, as if trying to steady herself. She looked at him with a quiet intensity, her violet eyes studying him as if seeing something deeper. "I thank you," she said after a moment, her voice gaining strength. I thought I was going to die there." Miles let out a small sigh of relief, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He'd done it. He'd saved her. But now, the question of who she was lingered in the back of his mind. Her strange appearance, her alien features. It was clear that she wasn't human. He could tell by the way her body responded to the cold, how she shivered under the thin layer of blankets. The Sci-fi Dominion. The name he would soon learn was known for its highly intelligent, but physically delicate, people. They couldn't survive temperatures below freezing. That much was clear. Do you know what happened to your ship?" Miles asked, his voice gentle. Visalvana, still dazed but regaining her strength, slowly nodded. "My shuttle was sabotage," she whispered. "I'm not supposed to be here." Her words sent a chill down Miles' spine, and a sense of unease crept over him. He'd found her by chance, but there was more to this story than just a random distress signal. Someone had tried to kill her. "Then we need to figure out what happened," he said firmly, his jaw tightening. He wouldn't let someone like her, someone so fragile, yet so strong in spirit, be lost to whatever conspiracy was unfolding. No one deserved that. Not while he was still breathing. And as he looked into her tired but resolute eyes, he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But he wasn't going to turn back now. Not when her life was in his hands. The storm outside continued to rage with the fury of 1,000 icy winds, but inside the Nomad's resolve, Miles Carter focused all his attention on the woman in front of him. Her name, as she had told him, was Exalvana, and she was no ordinary traveler. She was a princess from a powerful alien race known as the Sci-fi Dominion, a species renowned for their intelligence, but cursed with fragile bodies that couldn't survive the harsh conditions of most planets. After the emergency heating system kicked in and she started to recover, the questions kept coming to Miles. Why had she been out here alone? And what was her true mission? For now, though, he had more immediate concerns. Miles had managed to warm Salvana up enough for her to regain consciousness, but her strength was still fading. The medical systems were working, but they weren't fast enough. She needed more than just heat. She needed time, and time wasn't on their side. The warships she had mentioned before, the ones sent by her people to track her down, were still out there, and they were probably closer than he liked to think. If they picked up her distress signal and traced it to his ship, Miles and Exalvana wouldn't just have to face the cold anymore. They'd be facing a fight for their lives. He moved quickly to the cockpit, checking the navigation system for any signs of incoming ships. The screen was filled with static from the blizzard, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He tapped a few buttons and adjusted the ship's sensors, scanning the horizon for any movement. There were no obvious signs of enemy ships, yet, but that didn't mean they weren't out there. Miles knew enough to trust his gut. It was only a matter of time before the Sci-fi warships arrived. Returning to the main cabin, Miles found Salvana sitting up, her eyes clearer now, but still clouded with confusion. She looked fragile, as if a gust of wind could knock her over. But her spirit was strong. Even though she was physically weak, there was a fire in her eyes that refused to die. "You need to rest," Miles said, his voice firm but gentle. He didn't want to push her, but he needed to make sure she wasn't overexerting herself. "You've been through a lot." Zalvana nodded slowly, but her gaze never left him. She was too aware of the danger. "I can't rest," she replied softly. My people, they'll come for me. I've made a mistake coming here. If I don't stop them, they'll. Her voice trailed off, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Miles could see the fear in her eyes now. Fear not of dying, but of what her people might do to her once they caught up. Whatever it was that had led to her being out here, running from her own people, it was deeper than just a simple political disagreement. There was something darker at play, something that made Exalvana's escape from her own kind seem more like a death sentence than an act of freedom. Miles stood tall, walking over to her and placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll deal with it, he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. We'll figure it out. You're not alone in this. Exalvana looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of doubt. But there was none. She could see it in his eyes. He was committed. Miles wasn't the kind of man to back down from a fight, and she could tell that no matter how impossible the odds, he wouldn't leave her to face it alone. The silence between them was heavy, but in that moment, Exalvana realized something. For the first time since her crash, she didn't feel entirely alone. Maybe, just maybe, this human, this stranger who had saved her, could be the ally she so desperately needed. The hum of the ship's engines filled the silence, and Miles glanced over his shoulder at the darkened viewport. The storm outside continued to rage, but there was something about the way the ship had held together through the tempest that made him feel oddly hopeful. Whatever came next, they would face it together. But first, they needed to escape the planet, and they needed to do it fast. Miles turned back to Exalvana. You need to rest, but we need to leave soon, he said, his voice filled with urgency. The longer we stay here, the more dangerous it gets. We don't have much time. Exalvana nodded, though a new sense of determination filled her. Then let's go. I'm not running anymore. Whatever happens next, I'm ready. Miles couldn't help but smile. That's the spirit, he said. They had no idea what lay ahead, but they were ready for it. The Nomad's resolve lifted off with a gentle rumble, its engines roaring to life, as Miles Carter guided the ship through the thickening snowstorm. Exalvana sat strapped into the co-pilot's seat, her silver-blue skin now warmer and her strength slowly returning. She was still pale, her energy just beginning to build back up, but the spark of determination in her eyes burned brighter than ever. As the ship broke through the storm clouds and into the cold blackness of space, Miles set a course for the nearest space station, hoping to find some answers, or at the very least, a safe place to rest. Where are we going? Exalvana's voice was soft, but steady now. The change in her demeanor hadn't gone unnoticed by Miles. She had gone from fragile and lost to resolute and ready. It was as if the moment they left the cold planet behind, she found a renewed sense of purpose. We're going to a place called Dusthaven, Miles replied, his hand steady on the controls. He didn't look at her directly, keeping his eyes on the blinking lights of the console. It's a neutral station, far from any of the main factions. If you're going to explain yourself or lay low, that's your best bet. Exalvana took a deep breath and looked out of the viewport, her violet eyes scanning the endless stretch of stars before them. Dusthaven. I've heard of it. It's a haven for people running from their pasts, isn't it? Miles nodded, his lips curling into a grim smile. That's one way to put it. It's a place where people can disappear if they need to. But I wouldn't get too comfortable. It's not a friendly place if you don't know how to navigate it. I don't plan on staying long, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Once I figure out who's after me, I'll handle it. I just need some time. Time to think. There was a heavy silence between them as the ship sped away from Vedra 7, the distant starfields growing larger in the viewport. Miles knew that the real danger was only beginning. Whatever Exalvana's enemies were planning, whatever power she wielded, they weren't going to stop until they found her. And with her being the Sarathari princess, he doubted they would let her disappear without a fight. As if reading his mind, Zalvanna spoke again. I didn't come here by choice. My people, my father. They're preparing for war, and I didn't agree with it. I couldn't just stand by and watch. She paused, as though weighing whether or not to say more. Finally, she met Miles' gaze, her eyes filled with sorrow. I betrayed them. Miles absorbed her words, his expression unreadable. It wasn't the first time he'd met someone on the run from their own people, but there was something different about Zalvanna's situation. There was a heaviness in her voice, a sadness that went beyond fear or survival. She wasn't just running from an enemy, she was running from her own destiny. And that kind of burden was hard to carry. You made your choice, Miles said, his voice soft but resolute. Now, you'll live with it. No one can tell you what to do, not anymore. Zalvanna didn't respond right away, but she seemed to take some comfort in his words. She leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the ship's engines fill the silence. Miles watched her for a moment, then turned his focus back to the ship's controls. Dusthaven wasn't far, but the journey felt longer with each passing minute. There was no telling what awaited them when they arrived. Zalvanna's enemies would be closing in, and Miles knew that danger would find them soon enough. But for now, all they could do was keep moving forward, one star at a time. The journey to Dusthaven was tense, filled with the hum of the ship's engines and the occasional flicker of the control panels. Miles could feel the weight of the uncertainty pressing down on him as they flew deeper into the uncharted reaches of space. The farther they moved from Vedra 7, the more he felt the growing sense of danger. Zalvanna's enemies were not far behind. He could almost sense them, lurking in the black void, watching, waiting for a chance to strike. Zalvanna had been quieter since they left the cold planet, her mind clearly preoccupied with the mess she'd left behind. Her eyes, once filled with confusion and fear, were now clouded with something else. Regret, perhaps. She had left her people behind, but the decision had clearly weighed heavily on her heart. Miles knew better than to ask about it right now. He could tell she wasn't ready to talk. Still, he kept a watchful eye on her. The strain in her features told him that whatever was coming wasn't just about her enemies. It was about her own internal battle. We're almost there, Miles said, breaking the silence. He had been flying for hours, but the view outside the ship's viewport hadn't changed. The stars stretched on, distant and indifferent, as Dusthaven loomed closer. It wasn't much. A lonely station floating in the middle of nowhere, built by mercenaries, smugglers, and the occasional runaway. But it was safe, for now. Zalvanna nodded but didn't say anything. Instead, she shifted in her seat, her eyes scanning the vast emptiness around them. There was a palpable sense of tension in the air. She was waiting for something, and Miles couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the usual danger of being hunted. There was something more to her situation than she had let on. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but he was certain that once they landed, the truth would be revealed in one way or another. As they drew closer to Dusthaven's coordinates, Miles set the ship on autopilot and moved to the rear of the cabin. He needed to double-check the weapons systems. Even though Dusthaven was a haven for the desperate, it wasn't always the safest place to be, and with Zalvanna on board, it was best to be prepared for anything. He pulled open the weapon locker and began making sure the ship's defenses were ready for a possible confrontation. The last thing he wanted was to be caught off guard, especially with how tense things were getting. He didn't trust the people on Dusthaven. Too many had their own agendas. Miles had been there before, and he knew how quickly a safe haven could turn into a battleground. From behind him, Zalvanna's voice interrupted his thoughts. "You're preparing for something." Her tone wasn't accusing, just observant. He turned to face her, raising an eyebrow. "I'm preparing for anything. Dusthaven isn't as safe as it seems. People there will help you, but they'll expect something in return." Zalvanna gave a small, wry smile. "I'm used to that." She wasn't wrong. Zalvanna had been raised in a world of politics, where favors were currency and alliances were fragile. She understood how the game worked, perhaps better than anyone. "You'll be fine," Miles added, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. "Just keep your head down, don't draw attention to yourself, and we'll get what we need. Once we're off this station, we can figure out what comes next." Zalvanna didn't respond, but Miles noticed her grip tightening on the armrest. She was still uneasy, and he couldn't blame her. Whatever her past had been, it had left deep scars. The journey ahead would be a dangerous one, filled with secrets, lies, and enemies that could turn allies in an instant. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough to keep moving forward. Dusthaven was only minutes away. Miles could feel the station's presence in the air, like a shadow hanging just outside the reach of their ship. He didn't know what would await them there, but one thing was certain: nothing in this galaxy came without a cost. And as they approached the station, he knew that the price of Zalvanna's freedom and his own safety would be much higher than either of them anticipated. The Nomad's Resolve docked at Dusthaven with a soft thud, the ship's landing gear locking into place on the worn, rusted platform. Miles Carter released a slow breath, his eyes scanning the control panel one last time before shutting the engines down. He didn't trust Dusthaven, but at this point, it was their only option. He turned to Zalvanna, who was staring out the viewport, her violet eyes fixed on the station ahead. She looked more composed now, but there was an undercurrent of tension in her posture. Even though she had recovered some of her strength, Miles could sense that the storm inside her wasn't over. "This is it," Miles said as he unstrapped himself from his seat. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of unease there that he couldn't hide. Dusthaven wasn't the kind of place where people found peace. It was a haven for the desperate, the ones trying to escape their pasts, and the ones with nowhere else to go. It was as much a prison as it was a refuge. Zalvanna nodded, but she didn't speak. Instead, she stood slowly, her hand resting lightly on the back of her seat for balance. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before moving toward the hatch. As she reached the airlock, she turned to Miles, her gaze piercing. "I'll handle what I need to hear, but I won't stay long." Miles gave her a reassuring nod, but inside, he wasn't sure if her plan was going to work. Dusthaven wasn't a place where anyone got what they wanted without making some kind of deal, and there were always strings attached. People here didn't do favors for free. Just be careful. Don't trust anyone too easily. You never know who's watching. Zalvanna gave him a tight smile. "I know how to survive." They walked to the airlock together, and Miles let out another breath as the hatch opened with a low hiss. The sound of the station's buzzing energy greeted them, along with the sharp scent of metal and stale air. Dusthaven was a tangled mess of rusted walls and dimly lit hallways. The station's interior had seen better days, with exposed wiring and flickering lights casting long shadows on the metal floors. It was the kind of place that made you feel like you were always looking over your shoulder, always wondering if someone was about to betray you. Miles took the first step off the ship, his boots clicking on the cold metal floor. He didn't want to stay in the open for too long. Even in this dilapidated corner of space, Dusthaven had eyes everywhere. They were already a little too exposed. He gestured for Zalvanna to follow, and she fell into step beside him, her expression unreadable. The hallway ahead was quiet, the kind of silence that made Miles uneasy. He had a bad feeling about this place. Something about it didn't sit right with him. They moved quickly, keeping their pace steady as they navigated the narrow corridors. As they approached the central hub of the station, they passed by groups of people hunched in doorways, their eyes watching them closely but saying nothing. There was a chill in the air, the kind that only existed when there was something dangerous lurking just out of sight. Zalvanna's hand brushed the side of her jacket, as if checking something hidden beneath, a subtle motion that Miles noticed. She was on edge too, but she didn't show it as openly as he did. That was one thing he had learned about her. She was a lot more controlled than he'd originally thought. Whatever had driven her to leave her people behind, it had hardened her in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. They reached a small bar at the center of Dusthaven, the low hum of quiet conversation filling the air. Miles made a quick assessment of the room. The usual crowd, mercenaries, smugglers, exiles, and the occasional bounty hunter. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and everyone was too busy watching their own backs to care much about newcomers. But Miles didn't trust that peace for a second. The real danger was always hidden beneath the surface. Zolvana turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to speak with someone. They'll know where I can find answers." Miles hesitated. "And what's the price for these answers?" She met his gaze, her expression hardening. "I'll pay it." The silence between them stretched, and Miles couldn't help but feel that the cost was going to be much higher than either of them anticipated. As they stepped into the crowd, the doors to Dusthaven seemed to close behind them with a finality that felt like a trap. The air in Dusthaven felt thicker as Miles and Axalvana made their way deeper into the station's belly. The atmosphere was a mix of too much smoke, too many secrets, and too many eyes watching every move. Axalvana had a clear goal in mind, but Miles knew better than to assume it would be an easy task. In a place like this, nothing came for free, and everyone had their price. They reached a shadowy corner of the bar, where a bulky figure sat at a table, his face partially obscured by a hood. His presence alone made the air grow colder, and Miles couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was about to find them. Axalvana stopped in front of the man, her voice steady but low. "I need information, someone who can track a fleet of Sarathari ships, and I need it fast." The figure didn't move at first. His eyes, glowing faintly under his hood, scanned her like a predator evaluating its prey. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice gravelly and cold. "You're asking for a lot, Princess. Information like that doesn't come cheap." Zolvana didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her posture calm, though her fingers flexed subtly by her side. "I'm prepared to pay. Just tell me how much." The man chuckled darkly, a sound that sent a shiver down Miles' spine. He had the distinct feeling this wasn't just about money. The man leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he looked at both of them. "Money. You think you can buy this information with credits? You're asking for something that could change the balance of power in the galaxy. People don't just give that kind of information away." Zolvana's eyes flickered with a dangerous fire. "I didn't ask for your opinion. I asked how much." Miles watched the exchange closely, his hand hovering near the small blaster he kept hidden under his jacket. He had a feeling this wasn't going to end with a simple transaction. The tension in the room had risen, and the eyes of the other patrons seemed to grow sharper, their attention shifting toward the confrontation. Dusthaven was full of sharks, and Zolvana had just dropped herself into their feeding ground. The man leaned forward, his face now fully visible under the hood. He wasn't human. His skin was an unnatural shade of gray, his eyes glowing with a faint yellow light. His alien features were sharp, and his voice seemed to carry a weight that made everything around them feel heavier. "I'll make you a deal," he said slowly. "I'll give you the information you want, but there's a catch. You'll owe me a favor, and you won't be able to run from it. When I call, you'll come. No questions asked. Understand?" Zolvana met his gaze without hesitation, though Miles could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She had no choice but to agree. There were too many enemies on her tail for her to waste time here. The information the man held was invaluable, but a favor, that could cost them both more than they were prepared to pay. "I understand," Axalvana said quietly, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "I'll honor the deal." The man nodded slowly, his lips curling into a sinister smile. "Good. Then you'll get what you came for." He pulled a small device from his pocket, setting it on the table between them. The screen flickered to life, showing a map of the galaxy, with several red dots blinking in a precise pattern. "This is the last known location of the Sarathari fleet you're chasing. They're moving fast, but not fast enough to escape me." Zolvana leaned forward, studying the map closely. The Sarathuri ships were within striking distance, and the time to act was now. But as she reached out to grab the device, Miles couldn't shake the feeling that they had just made a dangerous bargain. One favor, that could mean anything. He stepped closer to Xalvanna, his voice low. "Are you sure about this?" She didn't look at him. Instead, she took the device from the table, her hand steady as she pocketed it. "I don't have a choice." Miles didn't say anything more. He knew that once a deal was made in Dusthaven, it was a done deal. And the price for it? They wouldn't know until it was too late. The heavy silence that fell over the bar was deafening. The deal had been struck, but the weight of it lingered in the air like an invisible storm. Miles stood at the edge of the table, watching Xalvanna with a mix of concern and curiosity. She hadn't said a word since they left the shady figure behind, the device securely tucked in her pocket. But Miles could sense the turmoil brewing just beneath her calm exterior. This wasn't just a simple trade. It was the beginning of something much bigger, and they both knew it. Xalvanna's pace quickened as they made their way back through the maze of Dusthaven's corridors. She was intent on getting out of this place as quickly as possible. The map on the device showed the Sarathuri fleet moving fast, and every moment wasted brought them closer to a fight they might not win. But there was another fear weighing on her mind. The deal. She had agreed to something without knowing what it would cost. The thought gnawed at her, but there was no turning back now. She had to follow through, no matter the cost. The sounds of the station, once muffled by the tension, began to return to normal as they reached the docking bay. The crowd bustled, oblivious to the dangerous exchange that had just taken place. It was a world of its own on Dusthaven, and everyone was just trying to survive, no matter the price. Miles kept a careful eye on their surroundings. It was strange. The station felt both like a refuge and a prison at the same time. The closer they got to the Nomad's resolve, the more he could feel the pull of the galaxy outside, the freedom that still existed beyond this place. But the promise of answers, the need to protect Xalvanna, and the looming threat of the Sarathuri fleet made the world outside feel distant, almost unreachable. Xalvanna stopped suddenly, her hand gripping the side of the ship's hatch. She turned to face him, her eyes piercing through the dim light of the docking bay. "We need to move quickly," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "The fleet isn't far from here, and they'll be looking for me. I won't let them get any closer." Miles nodded. He had no doubt she'd do whatever it took to stop them, but he knew there were limits to how much even she could do on her own. They needed more than just information. They needed an edge, something that could give them a fighting chance. And for that, they would have to risk more than they ever had before. As they boarded the Nomad's resolve, the familiar hum of the ship's systems came to life, but the tension between them remained. Miles activated the controls, setting the ship on a course toward the location the map had shown. The Sarathuri fleet was nearby, and they had no time to waste. But as the engines powered up, Miles felt a sudden unease. Dusthaven was behind them, but the galaxy ahead was just as dangerous. "You didn't have to make that deal," Miles said, his voice barely above a whisper as he focused on the controls. "Whatever they ask, whatever they want from you, it won't be easy." Xalvanna didn't answer at first. She stood near the viewport, her eyes fixed on the stars ahead. After a long moment, she turned to him. "I know the risks," she said quietly, "but I can't run anymore. Not from my past, not from what I've done. And I won't let them take everything I've worked for." Miles met her gaze, understanding more than she realized. He knew what it was like to be haunted by past decisions, to feel the weight of choices made long ago. And even though he didn't agree with everything she'd done, he knew one thing for sure. Xalvanna was no ordinary person. The strength in her was undeniable, and in that moment, he realized that they were in this together. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The ship slipped into faster-than-light travel, the stars blurring into streaks of light as they hurtled toward their destination. Miles tightened his grip on the controls, his eyes focused on the road ahead. But even as the stars stretched out before them, there was one thing he couldn't ignore. Whatever lay ahead, the storm was coming, and there was no escaping it. The galaxy had taken notice, and now they were part of something much bigger than either of them could have ever imagined. The true fight was about to begin.